It started with something that should have brought me peace, my garden. I had spent weeks planting herbs, tomatoes, some lavender, and even a few sunflowers to brighten up the walkway. Nothing fancy, just a small, cozy patch of earth I'd carved out near my porch. The kind of thing that makes a house feel like a home. Neighbors would pass by and smile, sometimes even stop to say how lovely it looked, and honestly, that garden became my daily therapy. Every morning I'd water it, trim it, just breathe in the scent of real life. But one morning, I found something else waiting for me. Not compliments, not peace, but a white envelope from the HOA taped to my door. Inside, a $500 fine for unauthorized landscaping. I blinked, read it again, then again. I couldn't believe it. I thought it had to be a mistake. 500 for my plants? That moment felt unreal, like someone had fined me for breathing. The notice didn't explain much, just that my garden violated Section 14 of the HOA rules, which I had supposedly agreed to maintain strict uniformity of outdoor appearances. Whatever that meant. I'd never seen anyone get fined for having a few plants before. And mine? Mine weren't wild or ugly. They weren't blocking sidewalks or crawling into anyone's property. It wasn't some jungle. I wasn't growing vines up the HOA office. But the letter sounded final, cold, robotic. Failure to comply may result in additional penalties. I felt my stomach twist. I stood there in the doorway, holding that notice like it was a slap in the face. Still, I told myself it had to be a mix-up. Maybe someone filed the wrong address. Maybe it wasn't even meant for me. So, I grabbed the HOA manual I'd tossed in a drawer years ago, the one nobody ever really reads unless they're bored or in trouble. And as I skimmed through the painfully dry text, a terrible realization set in. The rules did mention uniformity, but in the vaguest way possible. Uniform landscaping aesthetics shall be maintained. That's it. No examples. No list of banned plants. No clarification of what uniform even looked like. Just a sentence that gave them the power to decide whatever they wanted, whenever they wanted. I started to wonder, was this even about my garden or something else? I decided to check with my neighbor, Carol. She had roses out front and a bird bath that chirped with life every morning. Surely if I was fined, she was too, right? But when I asked her, she looked at me like I was speaking another language. A fine? For what? Your garden's adorable, she said. They never said a word to me. That's when something clicked. This wasn't about rules. It was about who they wanted to enforce them on. The HOA wasn't about fairness. It was about control. And if they thought I was just going to pay quietly and let it go, they were in for a surprise. After that $500 fine landed in my hands like a slap out of nowhere, I couldn't just sit back and accept it. I mean, come on, how can a few tomato plants and lavender become a criminal offense in your own front yard? My gut told me there was more to this than just a landscaping issue, so I sat down with that crusty, barely legible HOA manual I dug out earlier and decided to read every word of it. Not just skim, read, front to back. If they were going to use their so-called rules to hit me with fines, I wanted to understand exactly what game they were playing. And oh boy, the deeper I went, the more ridiculous it got. Right from the start, the language felt like it was designed to confuse you. Every line was buried in vague terms like appropriate, uniform, standard appearance, and community harmony. What does any of that even mean? There were no pictures, no examples, no specific plants that were allowed or banned. It was like trying to follow a recipe where the ingredients were just some stuff, and the instructions were make it look nice. So basically, they had written the rules in a way that gave them complete freedom to interpret them however they liked, and enforce them however they pleased. It didn't take long before I realized this wasn't about actual violations. This was about power. And the HOA loved holding that power like a golden scepter over everyone's heads. I started highlighting every section that felt suspicious. One clause said, homeowners must maintain the visual standards of the neighborhood. That's it. No guideline, no visual standard chart, nothing. Another one read, alterations to the exterior environment must be submitted for approval. Wait, does that mean if I plant a flower, I need a permit? That can't be right. So I flipped back a few pages, trying to find if alterations had ever been defined. Spoiler alert, they hadn't. It could mean anything from building a fence to trimming your bushes a little differently than your neighbor. That level of vagueness wasn't just unfair, it was strategic. They had crafted the handbook like a legal trap where anyone could be found guilty of something at any time. The more I read, the angrier I got. There was even a section that said seasonal decorations had to be taken down within a reasonable time frame. What does that mean? Whose idea of reasonable are we talking about here? One guy's reasonable could be 2 weeks, another could say 2 months. I remembered seeing a neighbor who left their Halloween decorations up until mid-November, and nothing ever happened to them. But when I put up a few fairy lights on my garden trellis during spring, I got a warning. That's when I started realizing something darker. This HOA didn't treat everyone equally. They targeted people, and apparently, this time, that person was me. I decided to go talk to a few of my neighbors to see if they had similar experiences. That's when things got even weirder. One guy down the block, Sam, who had a neatly trimmed bonsai garden out front, told me he got a warning last year for non-native plant choices. I blinked. Non-native? Since when were we running a botanical purity test? He said the notice didn't cite any rule, just a suggestion that his plants might not be in line with regional aesthetic norms. Seriously? What even are regional aesthetic norms? Do we have to match the soil content to colonial preferences now? Then there was Susan, a sweet woman with a colorful butterfly mural painted on her mailbox. She told me they threatened her with a fine too, not because it was vulgar, offensive, or ugly, but because, and I quote, "it was too whimsical." That's when I realized, it's not just about gardens, it's about control, taste policing, and weirdly specific gatekeeping. The HOA was like a picky landlord with a god complex. But still, I wasn't done. I went through the board's meeting notes. Yep, those boring PDFs they upload once a month that no one actually reads. And buried in one of the older files from a year ago, I found something that made my heart rate spike. A discussion labeled "Concerns about Front Yard Personalization Trend." It was vague, but it showed that someone in the board had already been bothered by homeowners adding too much character to their yards. The tone was clear. They didn't like individuality. They wanted a neighborhood that looked cloned. Cookie cutter. Anything outside the mold was a threat to their perfect little vision. So this wasn't random. It was part of a plan, or at the very least, a bias they had no problem acting on. Now I was really fired up. I printed every relevant clause, highlighted every contradiction, and even marked spots where the language was so vague it could apply to almost anything. I wanted to be ready. Not just for myself, but because I started realizing how many other people probably got bullied into silence. That's when Carol, my neighbor with the roses and the bird bath, told me something that nearly made my jaw drop. "They've always had a thing for control," she said, sipping her tea like she was telling me the ending to a long, dramatic novel. "You just poked the bear with your tomatoes." She wasn't wrong. Apparently 2 years back, there had been a couple who tried putting a small bench in their front yard. It matched the house. It was cute and discreet, but the HOA said benches weren't permitted and forced them to remove it. A bench. That's when I stopped seeing this as an overreaction. This was a pattern. At this point, I knew the fine wasn't just about my garden. It was about my independence. My decision to make something beautiful without asking for permission. And the HOA hated that. They wanted everything to go through them, to beg for approval like we were kids asking to go outside and play. I wasn't about to play that game, not anymore. But I also knew I couldn't fight fire with emotion. I needed proof, logic, patterns. I had to beat them at their own game. So I created a folder on my desktop titled HOA Case and started filling it with everything. Pictures of my garden, copies of neighbor yards with unapproved decor, PDF rules, email threads, and notes from my conversations. The more evidence I gathered, the clearer it became. This wasn't just a petty board. It was a system built on fear, silence, and interpretation. They relied on most homeowners being too tired, too scared, or too confused to push back. And honestly, I might have been one of them if that fine had been $50. But $500, that crossed the line. That made it personal. So I planned my next step carefully. I wouldn't rant, I wouldn't yell. I'd hit them with calm, collected logic, and I'd make it impossible for them to explain their double standards. I knew it wouldn't be easy, and I knew they wouldn't back down quietly. But I also knew something else. I wasn't backing down either. I closed my laptop, stared out at my garden, my peaceful, blooming little patch of rebellion, and smiled. This wasn't over, not even close, and I had a feeling the HOA wasn't ready for what came next. When I tell you I was done playing nice, I mean it. That $500 fine was the last straw, and after digging through their so-called rules and uncovering how vague, biased, and arbitrarily enforced everything was, I knew I couldn't let it slide. The thing is, I wasn't just fighting to save my garden anymore. I was fighting to expose something bigger, something rotten underneath the fake smiles and neighborhood harmony they love to preach. So, I sat down with my stack of highlighted HOA documents, a binder full of screenshots, pictures of other violations that went completely ignored, and a list of neighbors who'd shared their own silent horror stories. If I was going to take them on, I needed to be ready, because let's be real, they weren't going to just roll over and admit they were wrong. But they definitely weren't ready for how far I was willing to go. First, I wrote a formal appeal letter, polite but sharp. I broke down the lack of clarity in their handbook, cited specific clauses that contradicted each other, and pointed out multiple examples in the neighborhood of non-uniform landscaping that had never been fined. I even included photographs with dates, proving this wasn't a one-off thing. I knew better than to just rant or get emotional. I gave them facts, logic, and undeniable proof of selective enforcement. I submitted the appeal through the HOA portal and made sure to CC every single board member's email. No one was going to pretend they didn't see it. And then I waited. They didn't respond for days. Then a week passed. Finally, I got an email saying they'd review my case at the next monthly HOA meeting. I was invited to attend and present my appeal in person. Perfect. Exactly what I wanted. But I wasn't going in blind. I spent the next few days preparing like I was about to defend a thesis. I rehearsed my speech, printed out handouts, and even made a little slideshow in case they let me present digitally. Meanwhile, I kept talking to neighbors, gathering more stories, more examples. Turns out, the deeper I looked, the more people I found who had been quietly bullied, fined, or pressured into complying with rules that made no sense. Most of them had just paid the fine and moved on, afraid of rocking the boat. But that fear, that silence, that's what gave the HOA all their power. I wasn't afraid anymore. The night of the meeting arrived. It was held in the community center, a room that always smelled faintly of coffee and plastic chairs. I walked in with my folder, my notes, and my resolve. The board sat at a long table at the front, 5 of them, all wearing stiff smiles and business-casual clothes like they were running a miniature government. The president of the board, Mr. Langford, greeted me with the kind of fake courtesy that made your skin crawl. "We'll keep this brief," he said. Oh, but I had other plans. When it was my turn to speak, I stood up, thanked them for the opportunity, and launched into my presentation. I showed them my garden pictures, neat, tidy, not obstructing anything. Then I showed pictures of other homes with similar or even more eccentric landscaping features. I pointed out the inconsistent enforcement, the vague rules, the lack of due process. I even quoted their own handbook back at them. By the time I finished, you could feel the tension in the room. The board members exchanged glances. One of them, a woman named Karen, and yes, that was actually her name, no irony spared by the universe, tried to interrupt me with a condescending smile. "We just want to keep the neighborhood looking uniform," she said. But I didn't let her derail me. "Uniform by whose standard?" I asked. "Because the rules don't say what that standard is, and clearly, it changes depending on who's being looked at." That shut her up pretty quick. The board tried to keep their poker faces, but I could see it, cracks forming. They weren't used to being challenged like this, especially not publicly, especially not with receipts. After my presentation, they told me they'd take everything under advisement and give me their decision by the end of the week. Translation: they needed time to figure out how to handle being called out without admitting fault. But I wasn't done. The next day, I posted in the community Facebook group, not a rant, just a calm, detailed summary of my experience, what I found in the rules, and how many people had shared similar stories. I didn't call anyone names or point fingers. I just told the truth. And it caught fire. People started commenting, sharing their own horror stories, petty fines, sudden warnings, inconsistent enforcement. Some said they'd always felt like the board played favorites. Others said they never even knew they could appeal a fine. It became clear that I wasn't alone, not by a long shot. A few days later, I got another email from the HOA board. This time, they said after further review, they were rescinding the fine as a gesture of goodwill. I read the message 3 times. No apology, no admission of wrongdoing, just a quiet retreat, hoping I'd take the win and go away. But I wasn't going away. Because here's the thing. They didn't do it out of goodwill. They did it because I made noise, because I didn't back down. And now the rest of the neighborhood was watching. That same week, I put up a new trellis in my garden, painted it blue, bright blue, not to be petty, not to break rules, but to remind them, and myself, that I wasn't afraid. I followed the same vague standards they used against me. And this time, no warning, no fine, nothing. Because they knew I'd fight. And they knew I wasn't fighting alone anymore. But I wasn't just satisfied with my win. I started organizing, quietly, casually. Coffee meetups with neighbors, group chats, discussions about nominating new board members. The more we talked, the more we realized how easy it was for a few people with power to turn a peaceful community into a controlled space. And the more we learned, the more we wanted change. The HOA board had gotten too comfortable, too unchecked. But that was changing. The garden they tried to punish became a symbol, not just of rebellion, but of unity. People started planting more, adding wind chimes, decorative stones, even front porch furniture that was technically not approved. And suddenly, the neighborhood started looking alive again. Diverse, personal, free. The board tried to push back here and there, but it was clear they were outnumbered. They couldn't intimidate the entire community. Not anymore. They thought I was just a gardener, just one voice. But what they didn't realize was that when you target one person unfairly, you give them a reason to fight. And when others see that fight, they find the courage to stand too. The $500 fine was supposed to silence me. Instead, it lit a spark. And now the fire had spread. It all started subtly, almost like a quiet ripple in a still pond. But that ripple didn't stay small for long. After the HOA backed down and revoked my fine, word spread like wildfire. People didn't just notice, they remembered. They remembered every unfair warning taped to their doors, every unexplained charge on their statements, every rule that only seemed to apply to certain people, while others broke them without consequences. My garden had accidentally become the symbol of something much bigger, and I was no longer the only one unwilling to play by their twisted rulebook. Neighbors who had once kept their heads down started speaking up. It started with whispers, at the mailbox, during evening walks, at the local coffee shop. But those whispers started turning into plans, and those plans, they were about to turn into action. One of my neighbors, James, who lived 2 streets over, stopped by one afternoon. He was usually quiet, kept to himself, always waved but rarely chatted. But this time, he came with purpose. "I saw your post," he said, "and I've got my own story." He'd been fined twice, once for having a basketball hoop on his driveway, and once for hanging an American flag off his front porch. Both were technically allowed by state law, but the HOA had bylaws that contradicted them. He fought once, lost, and paid both times. He said he regretted not pushing back harder. "But now," he added, "I'm ready." And he wasn't the only one. Soon I had neighbors stopping by almost daily. Some came with questions, others with their own dusty paperwork, violation letters, meeting notes, emails that went unanswered. What we found was a pattern: selective enforcement, nepotism, fines issued without cause, rules added without community votes, and board members making decisions behind closed doors. The HOA had stopped being about maintaining standards long ago. Now it was about control, and people had had enough. But revolts, even small neighborhood ones, don't happen overnight. So we started planning, quietly, strategically, like the very board we were about to challenge. We created a private neighborhood group, not the public Facebook one the HOA monitored, but a closed group, invite only, for people we trusted. We called it The Real Neighbors of Pineview. Inside it, we shared documents, evidence, tips on how to legally challenge fines, and plans for attending HOA meetings en masse. The board had always relied on apathy, on people being too tired, too busy, or too afraid to question them. We were about to change that. The next monthly meeting came, and this time, the room wasn't half empty like usual. It was packed. Folding chairs lined the back wall, and people even stood along the sides. The board walked in, clearly not expecting the turnout. Mr. Langford did his usual opening remarks, but the fake calm in his voice cracked just slightly. You could feel it. Something had shifted. During the open floor portion, neighbor after neighbor stood up. James spoke about his flag fines. Dana brought up her repeated violation notices for having potted plants on her porch, plants that were never in anyone's way. An elderly couple shared how they'd been fined for excessive yard decor because of a single bird bath. The board tried to maintain control, but the crowd wasn't hostile. We were informed, prepared, and unified. Every question we asked, they dodged. Every rule we cited, they scrambled to justify. And people noticed. The illusion of control was starting to crack, and the more they squirmed, the more power we took back. After the meeting, something incredible happened. A neighbor named Priya, who had never even attended before, suggested we start preparing for board elections. She said, "If we want real change, we need new leadership, people who live here, people who care." That night, our private group turned into a campaign hub. We nominated candidates, designed flyers, and started going door to door, not to complain, but to talk, to listen, to remind everyone that they had a voice, and that the board only had power because we gave it to them. The board tried to retaliate, of course. They started threatening people with code violations, removed posts from the public group, even sent out a mass email warning against organized dissent. But all it did was fuel the fire. One morning, I woke up to see a yard sign in my neighbor's lawn. It read, "Vote for change. Vote for real neighbors." By the end of the week, over a dozen homes had signs. Some were handmade, others printed, some subtle, others bold. It wasn't about one person anymore. It was a movement, a quiet, determined revolt, not with torches and pitchforks, but with ballots and binders. And right when things were building momentum, the board tried to pull their dirtiest move yet. They attempted to change the voting rules. Quietly, with barely any notice, they proposed a rule requiring absentee votes to be notarized, something that would make it harder for elderly or out-of-town homeowners to vote. We found out 2 days before the vote, and when we did, we blew the whistle loud. Emails went out, posts were shared, phones rang. By the night of the emergency meeting, the room wasn't just full. It was standing room only. People were angry but controlled, passionate but respectful. When they tried to pass the rule, dozens of us raised our hands in protest. "You don't get to change the rules when you're losing," someone shouted from the back. And that's when it hit them. They were losing. That night, the vote failed. Barely. But it was enough. Enough to keep the playing field level. Enough to show that we were watching, that we weren't afraid. And the board? They saw it too. The turning point wasn't a speech or a single confrontation. It was a garden, a flag, a bird bath. It was everyday people who'd been pushed one time too many. And now, we weren't just fighting back. We were taking over. As the election approached, the board's energy changed. They were quieter, more cautious, more polite at meetings. They still tried to assert authority, but it didn't carry the same weight. People weren't intimidated anymore. They asked questions, demanded explanations, showed up in numbers, and slowly, the balance began to shift. Because the thing they forgot, the thing all power-hungry groups forget, is that when you abuse your authority long enough, eventually the people you're stepping on realize they have numbers. And numbers, they're louder than fear. So when I saw my once silent neighbor, the one who used to avoid eye contact, standing in his yard with a clipboard, talking to folks about the election, I knew. The revolt had begun. And no matter what the board tried next, the old way of doing things, it was already crumbling. And we were just getting started. It all came down to a single evening, the night of the HOA board elections. The energy in the community center felt more like a town hall from a political drama than a sleepy neighborhood meeting. People showed up in numbers that no one had expected. Some brought their kids. Others came straight from work, still in uniforms or scrubs. What started as a personal fight over a $500 garden fine had grown into something bigger than I ever imagined. My front yard became a battleground for fairness, and now The entire neighborhood was ready to choose sides. Ballots were handed out, names were called, and for a moment it all felt surreal. The same HOA board that once thought they held all the power now sat nervously behind their folding table, watching as person after person handed in a vote they never saw coming. When the results were announced, there was no dramatic cheering or slow clap like in the movies. Just a strange, powerful quiet, a wave of stunned silence, and then, slowly, soft applause. 2 of the 5 board members were voted out, replaced by neighbors we trusted, people we knew. James, the flag guy, was now the new treasurer. Priya, who had started that conversation about elections, was now vice president. It wasn't a full takeover, but it was enough. Enough to shift the balance. Enough to make sure that voices would be heard again. And honestly, that felt like a win. But winning wasn't just about seats on a board. It was about something deeper. We didn't just change names on paper. We changed the culture of our neighborhood. The next meeting had triple the usual attendance. People asked questions without fear. They shared opinions without whispering. Even the board members who stayed on seemed different, more open, more cautious, like they finally realized this wasn't their kingdom to rule. It was a community, our community. As for my garden, it's still there, blooming more beautifully than ever. But now, it's more than just flowers and mulch. It's a quiet symbol of what happens when you stand up, not just for yourself, but for what's right. I walk past it every day, and sometimes I catch a neighbor slowing down, smiling, pausing to look. And I know they remember. I know it means something now. But let's be real. It wasn't all smooth sailing. There were moments I questioned myself, nights I couldn't sleep, days I felt like giving up, not because the fight was too hard, but because I wasn't sure anyone else cared. I thought maybe I was just being petty over some plants, but that's what HOA power thrives on, making you feel small, like your voice doesn't matter. And that's the biggest thing I learned. It does matter. Your voice matters. Your story matters. And when you use it the right way, others find the courage to use theirs too. You don't have to be the loudest person in the room to make a difference. You just have to be the one willing to speak when no one else will. Because sometimes, that's all it takes to start a ripple. That turns into a wave. And if you've made it this far, maybe you've been through something similar. Maybe your HOA has crossed a line, or maybe you've seen something unfair and stayed quiet because it seemed easier. Trust me, I get it. But I hope this story reminded you that you're not alone, that it's okay to push back, that even a garden can be the start of a revolution. If you found this story powerful, relatable, or even just satisfying to watch someone take on the system and not back down, hit that like button, because every like helps push stories like this to others who need to hear them. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel. This is just one battle, but there are so many more stories waiting. Real people, real struggles, and real wins, no matter how small. Let's build a space where voices like ours are heard loud and clear, because sometimes all it takes to spark change is to tell your story.